Training Complex 7 was about to witness the kind of educational disaster that would become legendary across the galaxy. And everyone knew it except the small Korran cub who was currently staring down 3 centuries of military tradition, with the casual indifference of someone critiquing a mildly disappointing lunch menu. Dax measured exactly 4 feet of pure, concentrated defiance, wrapped in armor plating that rippled with adolescent rebellion. He'd managed to frustrate, defeat, or completely ignore every instructor the Galactic Military Academy had thrown at him, turning what should have been routine predator cub training into a philosophical crisis that was giving administrators nightmares. Standing before him was Sergeant Major Crix Thuron, whose collection of battle scars represented conflicts across 17 sectors, and whose current expression suggested he was reconsidering every life choice that had led him to this moment. "Cub Dax," barked Sergeant Major Crix Thuron, a veteran Velkari whose scars told stories of battles across 17 sectors. "You will complete the obstacle course, or you will repeat it until you do." Dax looked at the obstacle course, then at the Sergeant Major, then back at the course. His response was delivered with the kind of flat certainty that could stop conversations at 50 meters. No. The single word dropped into the training complex like a grenade with a faulty timer. Around the facility, other cubs paused in their exercises to watch what everyone assumed would be a brief but educational demonstration of military discipline. "Excuse me?" Sergeant Thuron's voice carried the dangerous calm that preceded either spectacular violence or spectacular stupidity. "I said no," Dax replied, settling into a relaxed crouch that somehow managed to look both casual and threatening. "The obstacle course is stupid, the training protocols are ineffective, and your teaching methods are approximately 3 centuries out of date." The silence that followed was so complete that you could have heard a pin drop in the next solar system. Sergeant Thuron's natural armor plates began shifting into what Velkari combat manuals described as pre-engagement configuration. This was the point where most sensible beings would apologize, comply, or at minimum stop insulting 3 centuries of military tradition. Dax, apparently, wasn't most sensible beings. Furthermore, he continued with the kind of academic precision that made the insult even worse. "Your assumption that physical conditioning equals tactical effectiveness demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare dynamics." I quickly activated my recording equipment, because whatever was about to happen, it needed to be documented for posterity, or as evidence at the inevitable court-martial. "Cub," Sergeant Thuron said, his voice dropping to frequencies that made the training complex's structural supports vibrate sympathetically. "You will show proper respect to your instructors." "Respect," Dax repeated thoughtfully, "is earned through competence, not demanded through intimidation. You want my respect? Demonstrate that you understand something about effective training methodologies." The other cubs had stopped their exercises entirely now, watching this unprecedented display of military insubordination with the fascination that came from witnessing historical events in real time. "That's it," Thuron declared. "Remedial discipline protocols, effective immediately." What happened next was like watching a carefully choreographed dance of mutual frustration. Thuron activated the training complex's disciplinary systems, designed to encourage compliance through progressively uncomfortable environmental conditions. Temperature fluctuations, sonic disruption, gravity variations, the whole arsenal of motivational techniques that had worked effectively on predator cubs for centuries. Dax ignored them completely, not just endured them, but actively ignored them, continuing his critique of academy training protocols as if he were delivering a lecture in comfortable surroundings instead of standing in what amounted to a military torture chamber. "The fundamental problem with your approach," he explained conversationally while gravity fluctuated between twice and half normal strength, "is that you're training us to follow orders without understanding context. This produces soldiers who excel at repetitive tasks, but fail catastrophically when faced with novel situations." Thuron cranked the environmental controls higher. "Modern conflicts," Dax continued, apparently unaffected by temperature variations that should have been causing hypothermia and heat stroke in rapid succession, require adaptive thinking, tactical flexibility, and the ability to make independent decisions under pressure. Your obstacle courses train compliance, not competence." By this point, Thuron was cycling through the environmental controls fast enough to give the other cubs motion sickness just from watching the readouts. Take this sonic disruption system, Dax said, raising his voice slightly to compensate for frequencies that should have been scrambling his inner ear. It's calibrated for species-standard hearing ranges, but it doesn't account for the fact that Korran auditory systems adapt rapidly to repetitive patterns. After approximately 47 seconds, I can filter out the interference completely. He was right. I checked my chronometer, and at exactly 47 seconds, Dax's posture relaxed as his hearing adjusted to compensate for the sonic interference. The gravity manipulation, he continued, moving through the fluctuating field like it was a mild inconvenience, follows a predictable cycle based on power consumption optimization. Once you understand the pattern, you can anticipate changes and maintain balance without conscious effort. Sergeant Theron's expression was cycling through emotions that his species didn't have names for. As for the temperature variations, Dax concluded, settling into a meditation pose that somehow looked insulting when performed by a juvenile predator. Korran physiology includes autonomous thermal regulation that kicks in under stress conditions. This system actually causes more discomfort to species with less adaptive biology. The training complex fell silent except for the hum of environmental systems that had just been rendered completely ineffective. How? Theron asked with the kind of calm that suggested his worldview was undergoing fundamental reconstruction. Do you know all of this? Dax looked up with the expression of someone explaining basic mathematics to a slow child. Because I actually studied the systems instead of assuming they would work because they've always worked. Understanding your tools is the first principle of effective warfare. That's when Director Stanton arrived. Director Stanton was human, which was unusual enough in a facility dedicated to training alien predators. She was also the Academy's senior behavioral specialist, which meant she got called in when traditional approaches failed spectacularly. Sergeant Theron, she said calmly, reviewing the training reports on her datapad. Status report. Cub Dax refuses to comply with basic training protocols, Theron replied, his professional composure intact despite the past hour of educational humiliation. Standard disciplinary measures have proven ineffective. Stanton looked at Dax, who was still sitting in his meditation pose, apparently completely comfortable despite environmental conditions that should have reduced most beings to quivering compliance. Hello, Dax, she said. I'm Director Stanton. I know who you are, Dax replied without opening his eyes. You're the human who developed the integrated tactical assessment protocols that increased Academy graduation success rates by 37% over the past 5 years. Stanton's eyebrows rose slightly. You've read my research papers? All of them. Also the classified ones that aren't supposed to be accessible to Cubs. I made a note to inform security that their data protection systems might need revision. And what did you think of them? Stanton asked with the kind of genuine curiosity that suggested she was more interested in academic discussion than disciplinary action. Dax opened his eyes and looked directly at her. Brilliant theoretical framework, but incomplete practical application. You identified the problems with traditional training methodologies, but your proposed solutions don't go far enough. Elaborate. Your research focuses on improving individual performance within existing command structures. But the real issue is that those command structures themselves are obsolete. Stanton sat down on a training mat, bringing herself to Dax's eye level. How so? Modern warfare is too complex for hierarchical decision-making, Dax explained, his academic tone suggesting he'd given this considerable thought. By the time information travels up the command chain and orders travel back down, tactical situations have already changed. You need distributed decision-making systems that allow rapid adaptation at all levels. That would require soldiers who can think independently while maintaining unit cohesion, Stanton observed. Exactly. Which means training programs that develop critical thinking skills alongside physical conditioning. Your current curriculum produces excellent followers, but warfare needs leaders at every level. Sergeant Theron looked like he was watching his entire profession become obsolete in real time. Interesting theory, Stanton said thoughtfully. But theory means nothing without practical demonstration. Are you willing to show us how your approach would work? Depends, Dax replied. Are you willing to let me design the demonstration? The silence stretched while Stanton considered the implications of allowing a rebellious cub to essentially take over a military training exercise. What did you have in mind? She asked. Dax stood up with fluid grace and gestured toward the other cubs, who had been watching the proceedings with fascination. Give me 1 week to train my fellow cubs using my methods. Then test us against any traditional training unit you choose. That's highly irregular, Korran protested. So is everything else about this situation, Stanton replied. What specific parameters did you have in mind, Dax? Tactical simulation exercises, complex scenarios that require adaptive thinking and independent decision-making. No predetermined solutions, no standard protocols, just objectives and constraints. And if your methods fail? Dax's armor plates shifted into patterns that Korran psychology texts described as absolute confidence. They won't. But if they do? If they do, I'll complete your entire training curriculum without complaint, serve as an example of proper compliance, and personally apologize to every instructor I've frustrated. And if they succeed? If they succeed, you revise your training protocols to incorporate distributed decision-making principles and adaptive tactical thinking. Stanton looked around the training complex, taking in the environmental systems that had failed to break a juvenile predator, the frustrated instructors, and the crowd of cubs who were hanging on every word of this unprecedented negotiation. 1 week, she agreed. But I choose the evaluation scenarios. Fair enough, Dax replied. But I choose my training team. Deal. As they shook hands, human to Korran cub, I realized I was documenting something that would either revolutionize military education or result in the most spectacular training failure in Academy history. Knowing Dax, it would probably be both. The next morning, Dax assembled his chosen team in Training Complex 7. Instead of the physically impressive cubs that most instructors would have selected, he'd chosen what looked like the Academy's collection of misfits, oddballs, and academic underperformers. There was Kai, a small Nexari female whose compound eyes seemed to see everything but whose physical scores were consistently bottom tier. Zoe, a human girl whose psychological profile suggested authority issues in 17 different languages. Rip, a Thraxian male whose mandibles never stopped clicking, which drove instructors crazy, but apparently conveyed detailed tactical information to anyone who spoke his frequency patterns. Interesting choices, I observed, as Dax's team gathered around him. The Academy measures success wrong, he replied. They value physical performance and compliance over intelligence and creativity. I chose cubs who think differently, not cubs who follow instructions better. And you think that will be sufficient for complex tactical scenarios? Dax's armor plates rippled with what might have been amusement. Captain Grimm, complex tactical scenarios are exactly where different thinking becomes most valuable. Over the next week, I watched Dax conduct the most unorthodox training program in Academy history. Instead of obstacle courses and physical conditioning, he held strategy sessions that looked more like academic seminars. Instead of drill exercises, he ran simulation scenarios where there were no correct answers, only better and worse decisions. Traditional training teaches you to follow orders, he explained to his team during one session. But what happens when orders are wrong, or when there aren't any orders, or when the situation changes faster than communication systems can handle? You improvise, Kai suggested, her compound eyes reflecting data streams from multiple sources. You adapt, Zoe added. You think, Rip clicked, his mandibles creating complex harmonic patterns. Exactly. And adaptation requires understanding principles, not just memorizing procedures. By the end of the week, Director Stanton had designed evaluation scenarios that would challenge Academy graduates, much less untrained cubs. Multi-objective missions with conflicting priorities, resource limitations, time constraints, and environmental hazards that required split-second decision-making. Ready? She asked Dax as his team took positions for the first scenario. Dax looked at his collection of misfits and academic underperformers, then at the complex tactical challenge that awaited them. We're ready, he said quietly. The evaluation scenario activated with a low hum that made the training complex walls shimmer like heat mirages. Suddenly, Dax and his team of misfits found themselves standing in what appeared to be a war zone from someone's worst nightmares. Scenario parameters, Director Stanton announced through the communication system. Hostile urban environment. Civilian population trapped in 3 separate locations. Enemy forces of unknown strength holding strategic positions. Your mission. Extract all civilians with 0 casualties while neutralizing enemy threats. Oh, she added, with what sounded suspiciously like sadistic satisfaction. You have 47 minutes before enemy reinforcements arrive, and the situation becomes unwinnable. I watched from the observation deck as seasoned academy instructors gathered to witness what they assumed would be a spectacular educational failure. Sergeant Thuron had brought popcorn, which seemed unnecessarily optimistic given the circumstances. Dax stood in the center of his team, looking around the simulated battlefield with the calm assessment of someone studying a particularly interesting puzzle. Around him, Kai's compound eyes were processing visual data at superhuman speeds. Zoe was analyzing structural weaknesses in nearby buildings, and Rip's mandibles were creating clicking patterns that sounded like advanced mathematical calculations. "Standard protocol," whispered Commander Locke Steiner, the Academy's senior tactical instructor, would be to establish defensive positions, conduct reconnaissance, then execute coordinated assault patterns. Dax apparently hadn't read that particular manual. Instead of following established tactical doctrine, he did something that made every instructor in the observation deck lean forward with horrified fascination. He split his team up. "Kai, civilian extraction point Alpha," he said calmly. "Use your visual processing to identify safe routes and hidden enemies. Zoe, structural analysis on the enemy stronghold. Find me the weakness that brings the whole thing down. Rip, electronic warfare and communication jamming." "Dax!" Kai's translator made her voice sound nervous. "Splitting forces violates basic tactical principles." "Basic tactical principles assume we're fighting a conventional engagement," Dax replied. "This scenario is designed to punish conventional thinking." Within minutes, his team had scattered across the battlefield like drops of mercury, each moving independently, but somehow maintaining coordination that defied explanation. "How are they communicating?" demanded Instructor Vale, staring at tactical displays that showed the Cubs operating in perfect synchronization despite being separated by kilometers of hostile territory. "They're not," Director Stanton observed quietly. "They're thinking." Kai reached the first civilian location and immediately began doing things that made evacuation specialists question their training. Instead of securing the area first, she started moving civilians before clearing threats. Instead of following predetermined extraction routes, she improvised paths based on real-time enemy movement patterns that only her enhanced vision could track. The result was evacuation efficiency that broke Academy simulation records. "Impossible," muttered Sergeant Thuron. "You can't move civilians through unsecured territory without casualties." "You can if you move faster than the enemy can react," I observed, watching. Kai guided civilian groups through what appeared to be suicide runs, but somehow worked perfectly. Meanwhile, Zoe had reached the enemy stronghold and was conducting structural analysis that would have impressed engineering professors. But instead of looking for ways to assault the position, she was studying load-bearing supports and stress distribution patterns. She's not planning an attack, Director Stanton realized. She's planning demolition. Rip had taken position in an abandoned communication tower and was doing something to the local electronic infrastructure that made the Academy's technical specialists very nervous. Enemy communication networks began failing in cascading patterns that suggested he understood their systems better than their own operators did. 31 minutes remaining, Stanton announced. That's when Dax made his move. Instead of coordinating a complex assault on multiple enemy positions, he walked directly toward the central enemy stronghold with his hands raised in apparent surrender. "What is he doing?" Thuron demanded. "Something very clever or very stupid," I replied, though I was beginning to suspect it was the former. Dax approached the enemy command position and was promptly captured, exactly as he'd planned. The simulated enemy forces dragged him into their stronghold for interrogation, which put him exactly where he needed to be for the next phase of his strategy. "Structural weakness identified," came Zoe's voice through the communication system, transmitting coordinates to all team members. "Electronic warfare complete," Rip clicked. "Enemy communications compromised. Reinforcement calls blocked. All civilians secured at Rally Point Delta," Kai reported, "ready for final extraction." From inside the enemy stronghold, Dax activated a small device that sent a pulse through the building's communication system. It looked like a standard distress beacon, But the frequency pattern was something that made Director Stanton grab her datapad and start rapid calculations. "He's not sending a distress signal," she announced with growing amazement. "He's sending structural harmonics, designed to trigger resonance failure in the building's support framework." The enemy stronghold began shaking itself apart from the inside out. Its own communication systems turned into demolition charges through pure applied physics. As enemy forces evacuated their collapsing base, they ran directly into Zoe's prepared positions, where she'd set up capture points that funneled them into containment areas. "All objectives completed," Dax announced as he emerged from the rubble, somehow uninjured, despite being at the center of a controlled building collapse. Total elapsed time, 34 minutes, 12 seconds. Civilian casualties, 0. Enemy neutralization, 100%. The training complex fell silent except for the hum of deactivating simulation systems. "How?" Sergeant Thuron's voice carried the bewilderment of someone whose entire worldview had just been deconstructed by a juvenile predator. "Simple," Dax replied, brushing dust from his armor plates. "We didn't fight the scenario. We understood it." Director Stanton was reviewing the tactical data with expressions that cycled between amazement and professional jealousy. "Explain your reasoning." "The scenario was designed to test conventional tactical response to overwhelming odds," Dax explained with the patience of someone teaching basic concepts. "But conventional tactics assume you have to defeat enemy forces through direct confrontation. We identified the actual objectives and ignored everything else." Elaborate. "Civilian extraction didn't require securing territory, just creating safe passage corridors that enemy forces couldn't predict or intercept. Kai's visual processing let us move civilians through gaps that conventional reconnaissance would miss." "And the enemy stronghold?" "Destruction was more efficient than assault. Zoe identified structural vulnerabilities, RIP compromised their communication networks, and I delivered the resonance device from inside their own defensive perimeter." Commander Steiner looked like he was watching his entire tactical manual become obsolete. "But you deliberately got yourself captured." "I used their capture protocols against them," Dax corrected. "They brought me exactly where I needed to be. Then their own security procedures prevented them from escaping when the building started collapsing." "This approach violates numerous established tactical principles," Thuron protested. "Which is why it worked," Kai observed, her compound eyes still processing combat data. "Enemy responses are calibrated for conventional attacks. Unconventional approaches bypass their defensive preparations." Director Stanton stood up slowly, and I recognized the expression of someone whose professional assumptions were undergoing fundamental revision. "The Academy's evaluation committee will need to review these results," she announced. "Of course they will," Dax replied. "Change makes people nervous." 3 days later, I found myself documenting what would become known as the Dax Revolution in military education. The Academy's evaluation committee had spent 72 hours analyzing his team's performance, running additional scenarios, and conducting interviews with tactical experts across the galaxy. Their conclusion was unanimous and terrifying. Traditional military training was producing soldiers who could follow orders brilliantly, but couldn't think independently when orders became irrelevant. "The problem," Director Stanton explained to the assembled faculty, "is that we've been preparing cubs for the wars we've already fought instead of the wars they'll actually face." The Academy's response was swift and comprehensive. New training protocols emphasizing adaptive thinking and independent decision-making. Simulation scenarios designed to reward creativity over compliance assessment criteria that valued problem-solving ability alongside physical performance. But the most significant change was subtle and revolutionary. They started listening to the cubs. "Traditional military hierarchy assumes that experience equals wisdom," Dax observed during his first official strategy session with Academy leadership. "But experience can also equal inflexibility. Sometimes the most effective solutions come from beings who haven't learned that certain things are impossible." 6 months later, Academy graduation rates had improved by 43%, and graduate performance in real combat situations showed improvement across every measurable category. The cubs weren't just learning faster, they were learning better. "The interesting thing," I noted in my final report, "is that Dax didn't refuse training because he couldn't do it. He refused because he understood it was wrong." Director Stanton nodded thoughtfully. And it took a human willingness to question established authority to give him the opportunity to prove it. About that, I said. What did you whisper to him during that final strategy session before the evaluation? He claimed you said something that changed his approach. Stanton smiled with the expression of someone who'd found the perfect solution to an impossible problem. I told him that the Academy's job wasn't to teach him how to follow orders. It was to teach him how to give them. And that made him cooperate? It made him understand that rebellion and leadership aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes the most effective way to change a system is to master it first. I looked through the observation window at Training Complex 7, where Dax was now conducting advanced tactical seminars for Academy instructors, his former opponents now hanging on every word as he deconstructed centuries of military doctrine with the casual expertise of someone who'd never learned it was supposed to be difficult. You know, I observed, when this story gets told in military academies across the galaxy, they're going to focus on the tactical innovations and adaptive training methods. Probably, Stanton agreed. But that's not really what happened here. No, she said quietly. What happened here was that a human decided to listen to a child who everyone else had dismissed as a problem. And that child taught us that the most dangerous enemy of effective thinking is the assumption that we already know everything we need to know. The Academy had learned something that day that went far beyond tactical doctrine or training methodology. They'd learned that sometimes the most important military skill is the willingness to admit that your most fundamental assumptions might be wrong. And sometimes, the beings best qualified to teach you that lesson are the ones who refuse to accept your limitations in the first place. Dax had refused training not because he couldn't learn, but because he understood that true learning required questioning everything, especially the things that everyone else accepted without examination. The Academy called it the Dax Revolution, but I knew better. It was just a very human approach to education finally being applied to alien students who were smart enough to recognize wisdom regardless of what species it came from. 2 years later, I found myself documenting the most ambitious test of Dax's revolutionary methods. The first inter-academy competition, featuring teams trained under the new adaptive protocols. Representatives from 47 worlds had gathered on Nexus Prime to witness what military historians would later call the Great Tactical Awakening. The competition was designed by the Galactic Defense Council as the ultimate test of military education effectiveness. Traditional academy teams would face off against institutions that had adopted the Dax protocols, with scenarios so complex that even seasoned generals admitted they had no idea how to solve them. This should be interesting, Director Stanton murmured, as we watched teams from across the galaxy take their positions. She'd been promoted to Director of Advanced Tactical Education, a position created specifically to oversee the implementation of adaptive training methods fleet-wide. Interesting is one word for it, I replied, noting the obvious tension between traditional military instructors and the new generation of educators who'd embraced unconventional thinking. Catastrophic might be another. The first scenario launched without warning, dropping 16 teams into a simulation that made Dax's original evaluation look like a children's game. Multiple hostile factions, shifting alliances, civilian populations with competing interests, resource constraints that changed hourly, and environmental hazards that required constant adaptation. Most teams immediately began implementing standard tactical doctrines, establish command structures, secure perimeters, conduct reconnaissance, develop assault plans. Textbook responses that had worked effectively for centuries. Dax's team, now consisting of the Academy's most promising adaptive thinkers, did something completely different. They started talking to the enemy. "What are they doing?" demanded General Thoric Val, the Centauri Defense Force's most decorated commander, as he watched Dax approach hostile positions with what appeared to be casual conversation, rather than tactical engagement. "Negotiating," Director Stanton observed with barely concealed pride. "Negotiating?" General Val's expression suggested that his understanding of military doctrine had just been violated in 17 different ways. "This is a combat simulation, not a diplomatic conference." "Actually," came Dax's voice through the communication system, "it's a problem-solving exercise disguised as a combat simulation." The scenario assumes that all factions have mutually exclusive objectives, but careful analysis reveals multiple, win-win solutions. On the tactical displays, we watched as Dax's team began implementing strategies that redefined the very concept of military engagement. Instead of defeating enemy forces, they were converting them into allies. Instead of securing territory, they were creating cooperative agreements that gave all factions what they actually needed rather than what they thought they wanted. "Impossible," muttered Commander Vex Korran, whose traditional Thraxian team was still conducting reconnaissance, while Dax's group was already solving the scenario's core conflicts. Military engagements require decisive action, not extended negotiation. Unless, Kai observed from her position as Dax's tactical coordinator, the real enemy isn't the opposing forces, but the assumptions that create unnecessary conflicts in the first place. Within 6 hours, Dax's team had transformed the combat simulation into a cooperative resource-sharing agreement that satisfied every faction's core objectives while eliminating the need for hostilities entirely. Their solution was so elegant that scenario designers had to add additional complications just to keep other teams engaged. "How did you identify the cooperative solution so quickly?" asked Dr. Yara Thorne, the Academy's head of strategic studies, during the post-scenario debriefing. "We listened," Dax replied simply. Traditional tactical analysis focuses on enemy capabilities and intentions, but it rarely examines underlying motivations. Once you understand what different factions actually need, finding mutually beneficial arrangements becomes relatively straightforward. "But what about situations where negotiation isn't possible?" General Val pressed. "Combat scenarios where enemies are genuinely hostile and cooperative solutions don't exist?" Zoe stepped forward with data displays that made the assembled military leadership very uncomfortable. "We analyzed 17 genuinely hostile historical conflicts from the Academy's tactical database. In every case, careful examination revealed underlying resource disputes, territorial concerns, or cultural misunderstandings that could have been resolved through alternative approaches." "Are you suggesting," Commander Korran asked slowly, "that most military conflicts are unnecessary?" "We're suggesting," Rip clicked, his mandible patterns creating complex harmonic frequencies, "that most military conflicts are symptoms of diplomatic failures rather than inevitable consequences of irreconcilable differences." The implications of this statement hit the assembled military leadership like a series of precision-guided philosophical weapons. "The Academy has been training us to be very good at fighting wars," Dax continued, his armor plates reflecting the conference room's lighting. "But nobody was training us to be good at preventing them." "Prevention requires understanding," Kai added, her compound eyes processing data streams that included psychological profiles, resource analyses, and cultural compatibility assessments. "Traditional military intelligence focuses on tactical capabilities, but adaptive intelligence examines systemic relationships." Director Stanton activated a holographic display showing comparative outcomes from the competition's various scenarios. Teams trained under adaptive protocols achieved objective completion rates 37% higher than traditional teams, with resource expenditure 42% lower and casualty rates approaching zero. "More importantly," she continued, adaptive teams consistently identified solution pathways that traditional teams never considered, creating outcomes that exceeded original scenario parameters. General Val studied the data with the expression of someone whose professional worldview was undergoing seismic shifts. "Are you telling me that these cubs have fundamentally redefined military effectiveness?" "We're telling you," Dax replied with characteristic directness, "that military effectiveness includes preventing conflicts that don't need to happen, resolving disputes that can be negotiated, and fighting only when absolutely necessary with maximum efficiency and minimum destruction." "Traditional training produces excellent warriors," Zoe observed. "Adaptive training produces excellent problem solvers who can fight when necessary but prefer solutions that make fighting unnecessary." The competition continued for 3 more days, with scenario after scenario demonstrating the superiority of adaptive thinking over conventional tactical doctrine. Traditional teams achieved their objectives through force, determination, and superior firepower. Adaptive teams achieved their objectives by redefining what the objectives actually meant. The most remarkable thing, I noted in my ongoing documentation, is that the adaptive teams aren't just winning the scenarios. They're changing them. By the competition's end, scenario designers had been forced to create entirely new categories of evaluation criteria. Traditional metrics like casualty ratios and resource expenditure were supplemented by measures of diplomatic effectiveness, systemic stability, and long-term conflict resolution. The Academy's new graduates, announced Fleet Admiral Cora Wade during the closing ceremonies, represent a fundamental evolution in military thinking. They understand that the ultimate victory isn't defeating your enemies, but discovering that they don't have to be your enemies in the first place. But what happens when real enemies exist? Asked Ambassador Vel Dracor, representing species whose histories included genuine existential conflicts. When negotiation fails, and adaptive thinking meets genuine malevolence. Dax exchanged glances with his team before answering. Then we fight with the same adaptive principles we use for everything else. We understand our enemies better than they understand themselves. We identify weaknesses they don't know they have. And we win so decisively that the conflict ends permanently. But we prefer, Kai added quietly, to make sure those situations happen as rarely as possible. The inter-academy competition's results were transmitted across the galaxy within hours, sparking debates in military institutions, diplomatic corps, and government councils on countless worlds. The implications weren't just tactical or educational, they were civilizational. What started as one rebellious cub refusing to follow orders, Director Stanton observed as we watched graduates from the new adaptive program disperse to assignments across the galaxy, has become a revolution in how we think about conflict, cooperation, and the purpose of military force itself. And it all happened, I noted with professional appreciation for historical irony, because a human decided to listen to a child who everyone else had dismissed as a problem. The best ideas often come from the most unexpected sources, she agreed. Sometimes the most important thing a teacher can do is get out of the way and let their students show them what's possible.